Alright, so today I have a video, Napoleonic Infantry Tactics, a quick guide by Epic History TV. Napoleon was a very brilliant strategist. He was probably one of the greatest in history. The Napoleonic wars and the strategies he employed really changed warfare, and it really changed the way that warfare would be conducted for a long time. Napoleon's strategies and tactics would be used all the way up through the American Civil War. Decades later, it would be the basis of all military thought for a very long time. It is seen as being a staple in military history. It is a turning point for military history in which a modernized form of warfare for the time comes into play and is sort of forced onto Europe, because in order to defeat Napoleon, his tactics have to be adopted and adapted to in order to beat him, because the tried and true tactics of before are now suddenly outdated and not going to work. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at this video.
In the Napoleonic Wars, infantry fought in close order, packed together, standing shoulder to shoulder. But why present such an easy target for the enemy? First, command and control. Before radios, orders had to be relayed by shouted commands, drums or bugles. Difficult enough in the smoke and din of battle. Almost impossible if troops were scattered. Second, firepower. Smoothbore muskets were inaccurate beyond about 80 yards, so volley fire, firing en masse, was the best way to inflict physical and psychological damage on the enemy. Third, morale. Soldiers were much more willing to advance into danger or hold the line if they did so together as a unit, urging each other on. Fourth, defense against cavalry. Scattered infantry were easy targets for horsemen. Only by sticking together could they fight them off. The basic tactical unit of infantry was the battalion. A French line battalion had, in theory, 840 men, but in practice, nearer 500 to 600. Our example here has 605 men, a typical strength for a battalion on campaign. The men were divided into 6 companies, 4 fusilier companies, and 2 flank companies. On the right,
That's another piece that I want to mention, is that it wasn't just his strategies and tactics that are adopted, but it's also his military organization. It's the way he organized his militaries into battalions and companies was really not done yet by anyone. They had different means of organization, far less organized versions of organization, and his method was so effective that we still use a very similar method today all around the world, not just us or in Europe, but all around the world. Any really strong, effective military has a very clear-cut hierarchical organization structure, and that primarily came from Napoleon. Napoleon completely reorganized the French military, and that's what gave him an edge later on, is that he was able to, it was a better plan by organizing his troops better. He could better design and execute a plan by saying, okay, company A, do this, company B, do that, instead of like, okay, you guys over here do this and you guys over here do that. It was much easier for him to design and execute plans, and that was so effective that everyone adopted it, and we have not changed since then. We have just improved upon it. But yeah, so once again, Napoleon's tactics completely changed everything.
the grenadiers, made up of the tallest, strongest men, often detached to form elite all-grenadier units. And on the left, the voltigeurs, specialist light infantry, used for skirmishing in front of the battalion. Skirmishers moved independently, used cover, and fired at will to harass and unsettle the enemy, while preventing enemy skirmishers carrying out the same task. Most armies also had specialist light infantry units for this role, such as the British 95th Rifles, French Chasseurs à Pied, and Austrian and Prussian Jäger battalions. The traditional battlefield formation was the line. All companies formed up alongside each other, 3 ranks deep. Line formation maximised the number of men who could fire their muskets at the enemy, and limited casualties from artillery fire. But it was extremely vulnerable to cavalry if it could be outflanked. And even for well-drilled troops, it was difficult to keep the line straight while advancing across broken ground. So for manoeuvre and attack, battalions usually formed a column of divisions. This was a more flexible formation that allowed the battalion to advance quickly, though it presented a larger target to enemy guns, firing solid round shot that would tear through several ranks, and far fewer men could fire their muskets at the enemy. Theoretically, therefore, the battalion would deploy into line before reaching the enemy. But carrying out this slow manoeuvre under fire wasn't always possible or sensible. So some commanders kept their men in column, relying on momentum to break the enemy line. This was a risky tactic that often worked against raw troops, but led to high casualties when facing better trained.
So this tactic of using columns and lines to charge is used up in the American Civil War, in which we see the first use, well, not the first use, but one of the first widespread uses of things like exploding artillery shells and things, and it devastates the lines. And Europe is watching this, and they're seeing it happen, and whereas they definitely start moving towards a different set of strategies, this idea is still not broken until after World War One. Because with World War One, you have the entrenchments, you have the trenches with the machine guns, and they are still sending lines of men with rifles to charge these enemy lines and be gunned down. And it was devastating because they were still using a form of a Napoleonic strategy, all the way up through World War One. I mean, a century later, this is how influential Napoleon was, and how effective Napoleon was. That even, the American Civil War obviously happens decades before World War One, and it was already being disproven as being outdated. It was already all proven as being outdated, and it was already being seen as probably not the best option. But the underlying strategy of it, so the use of the lines was less, not so much used in World War One, but the concept of sending waves and waves of men after the enemy line to try to use momentum and numbers to break the enemy line and eventually, get through Napoleon. It was Napoleon. So it's very interesting to see that these things that Napoleon did were still being used a century before. Of course, with the advent of the machine gun, it greatly changes how effective this was, and it causes a lot more casualties than what happened in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleonic Wars is an extremely effective strategy, but a century later, not so much. So we see Napoleon's infantry tactics being used all the way up through World War One, to a degree in World War Two, and to a degree it's used by many militaries even in the present day, but not nearly the same way. Napoleon's influence never really quite went away, but we've definitely learned our lessons from some previous wars in which we're like, okay, using a century-old strategy may not be the best idea.
Infantry, like British redcoats. A column could be closed up quickly to provide protection from cavalry, or if there was time, could form a square. With bayonets fixed, the battalion formed an all-round defence that often resembled more of a rectangle. Enemy cavalry could surround the battalion, but not break in, as horses won't charge a solid wall of men and steel. But an infantry square was extremely vulnerable to artillery fire, and could only move very slowly. Changing quickly and smoothly from one formation to another, especially under fire, required training, practice, and experience. In 1809, the Austrian army began to use the battalion mass formation, crude but more suited to hastily trained conscripts. This was a dense column.
Yeah, that's another factor that goes into Napoleonic Wars. So a lot of his enemies were using, far less trained men, and in some cases, more poorly equipped men, because they were trying to match the numbers of the French. Austria was able to do it. Russia was obviously able to do it because of their sheer numbers, but countries like Prussia are much smaller and just don't have the manpower to do it. But they were trying to just grab everyone they can to fight. So they were trying to adapt Napoleon's tactics and use them, but their men weren't as well trained, and they couldn't train them this way. Napoleon put a lot of emphasis on training his men very, very, very well. It was one of the reasons why he was so effective, and so the other countries are sort of just trying to hurry up and get an army to fight Napoleon, and so they're not training the men nearly as well. They're not equipping them as well in some cases, and so they're trying, at the same time, still trying to teach their officers these new strategies and tactics, and they do obviously eventually work because Napoleon is defeated, but they never quite match Napoleon until after the Napoleonic Wars are over, and they are able to really study what Napoleon did and apply it. They can redesign a military around this strategy instead of hastily throwing something together. So that was a huge aspect of the wars too. Why Napoleon was so successful is because even though once they started adapting his strategies, he was still much better at it, because not only had he designed them, but his men had been trained from the beginning on how to use it, whereas the enemies, the other countries, were figuring it out as they go, which gives France the obvious advantage.
With limited firepower and huge vulnerability to enemy cannon. But it could quickly close up to repel cavalry using the same principle as the square, but without the complex drill, and was much more maneuverable.
Yeah, that's not just a short little video, but I mean, Napoleon was a genius. He absolutely was. There's no debate on that. And he had a lot of very good commanders that were. Some of them had already been commanders when he took power. Others were hand-picked commanders, but he had a lot of very good commanders and very well trained lower officers. And his general military was just very well trained, well equipped. Napoleon was very good on the battlefield. His other commanders were very good on the battlefield because they were doing what he taught them to do. So there was a little less free thinking, but it worked out, because if you take away free thinking of commanders but replace it with one of the greatest military minds in human history, it's not a bad trade-off. Actually, one thing, if you wanted to know a little more on Napoleon stuff, there's this great book I have, Napoleon's Maxim of War. Now, it's a super easy read. It's just little things, and it's all these quotes and things by Napoleon on strategy and on warfare, on how warfare should be conducted. It's basically, the Sun Tzu's The Art of War, except written by Napoleon. All very short things. You can punch through it in like an hour tops. But if you're interested in Napoleonic War, right here, very cheap, very short, very easy, but you're gonna learn a lot on how Napoleon did things. But yeah, so Napoleon, like I said, he was very effective to the point where people are using his strategy all the way up until a century later, when finally technology just proves those strategies to be completely ineffective. So this series, this Napoleonic series, is actually suggested to me by another viewer, and so I'll definitely be checking out more of them. I just did this one first because it's kind of quick and simple, and I'm also very interested in just the strategies that Napoleon used. I feel like that's the real basis before you talk about battles in which Napoleon was in, and the war itself. It's good to understand how Napoleon's army worked, what he did that was different, why he was so effective. Once you understand that a little bit better, then you can start looking at his battles and see how he starts using these new strategies and tactics and ways of thinking and doctrines in actual combat, and how they're effective, how he proves them to be effective, and how his enemies have to try to adapt to this new form of warfare. So yeah, this video was really good. I've got a few recommendations actually for this series, so I'm going to definitely be checking out more videos on this. I'm very interested in Napoleonic Wars anyways, so it's probably something I would have found on my own, but I'm really glad somebody suggested this to me. A few people actually suggested this to me, so I will definitely be checking out more of them. Yeah, but I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. If you have any other videos you'd like me to check out, whether it's from this series or other videos, other history videos, I also do alternative history videos. Any of those, please put them in the comment section. I'll be sure to check them out. Stay tuned for more on this series coming in the future. I intend to do the entirety of the series, try to do it in order, but I think I've already broken the order. But I will definitely be trying to do it in at least chronological order of battles that happened. I won't be picking favorites on this, even though I'm a bit tempted, I have to admit. I would like to start with Austerlitz myself, but I know I should probably not do that. Anyway, I'm going to end the video there. So like I said, if you stay tuned, I will definitely have more. I love these videos. I love Napoleonic Wars. And actually, just as one more quick thing, I've actually been, if you are in the Boston area anytime, go to the Boston University Library. I think they still have it. They have one of the death masks of Napoleon. So the death mask is when someone died, they took a cast of their face and made a mask. It was bronze. They made it out of their face. So you would have this bronze image of their face, and this bronze cast of their face. And last I knew, which was a couple years ago, they still had it there. They have one of the three that were made. The other two are in Europe, obviously. But if you're up in the area, check to see if they have it. And if they do, go check it out. I checked it out about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was kind of giddy about it because I'm really big into Napoleon. So, but definitely something cool to check out if you're ever in the Boston area. Go to the library, just take a look at it. I think they still have it. I'm not 100% sure, so double check before you do it. But definitely something cool to check out if you're into Napoleon. Anyway, I will end the video for real this time, and I will see you next time.